Today on The Download presents Land O'Lakes Chief Marketing Officer, Heather Malenshek. From Getty Images, Head of Creative for the Americas, Tristen Norman. Vice President of Custom Solutions, Tawnya Crawford. And Director of Custom Solutions, Stacy Woods. And now, here's your host, Jennifer Kelly.
Hi, yes, it's me, Jennifer Kelly, Senior Customer Success Manager here at Getty Images, welcoming you to this very special episode of The Download Presents. Some quick housekeeping before we jump into today's program. As always, I want to give a big shout out to all of our current Getty Images customers joining us today, and thank you for your business. We truly appreciate it. Some portions of today's program have been pre-recorded, but don't forget to drop your questions in the Q&A below and we'll answer them live later in the show. And finally, we'll email a link to a recording of today's session later this week. So watch out in your inbox and be sure to share with your colleagues. All right, the house is kept. Let's get to it. Earlier this month, Getty Images, in collaboration with Land O'Lakes, launched a new rural U.S. collection of images and a visual GPS data-backed playbook called Repicturing Rural to help marketers and creatives tell more authentic visual stories. Here to lead today's conversation with some of the minds behind the project is Tawnya Crawford, VP of Custom Solutions. Over to you, Tawnya.
Thanks, Jen. Hello, everyone. I'm Tawnya Crawford, VP of Custom here at Getty Images, and I'm so excited to be guiding today's conversation. This project started with a simple insight. Rural Americans don't feel represented. And as we dug into that insight, what emerged wasn't just a marketing gap. It was a storytelling opportunity. This is a chance to leave behind outdated, one-dimensional stereotypes. And instead, we can embrace a fuller, more dynamic picture of what it really means to live in rural communities today. So I want to start just by grounding our conversation in why this topic is important, why this project matters right now. We understand the importance of authentic rural storytelling, data, and insights behind it. And also, we've started to uncover that there's a gap that this initiative set out to close. Heather, I want to start with you. Land O'Lakes has long been rooted in rural communities. Why focus on rural America now, and what felt urgent or more important about this project in this moment?
Yeah, thank you, Tawnya. Really good to be here, especially discussing, I think, what this is a really vital conversation that we need to be having. So we are, as some people may not know us as this way, but we are a farmer-owned cooperative based in the US. We're actually a global company. But our member owners are based in the US. And basically rural communities and rural stories are at the heart of everything that we do and who we are. And they're really the impetus for us convening what we're calling the Modern Rural Collective, which is a collective of brands and companies who are about as passionate as we are in terms of making sure that we're telling authentic rural stories. And so, as you said, the data and the work that we've done with Getty Images has been incredibly interesting and valuable for us, because when we look at the number of searches for content on rural America, it's up 22% in 2024. But as you mentioned, there's 2 in 3 Americans in rural communities that feel that they're really misunderstood and oftentimes ignored by marketers. So most people think of rural America, you've got a combination of things. It's either on one end of the spectrum, it's sort of this, abandoned downtown and potentially just like run down and empty. Or you have the pastoral view of rural America, which is the red barn and the red truck and, all those images you see around the holidays. People also often see rural America and the people who live there as perhaps undereducated, not innovative, no creativity, no sort of entrepreneurship. And in fact, the opposite is true. And I think many of those rural American towns, as we know them, are vibrant, are exciting, that are hotbeds of creativity and entrepreneurship. And they're vital to our country and our future. And I think that's the piece that perhaps people don't really take to heart. So the prosperity of every community in America, really, all the way to our food security, is dependent on these rural American towns. Because if we don't have a vibrant rural America where the food is being produced, you don't eat, essentially. So I always tell people, if you had food on your table today, thank a farmer, because that's generally where it comes from. At least about 87% of your food comes from there. So we owe our food security to these communities. And as a farmer-owned cooperative, we know that on a very intimate level because our member owners are farmers. So we're using that and using our influence and perhaps a superpower that we have to overhaul this cultural conversation that tends to overly simplify rural as the opposite of urban. And from the research that we've done, like when you do that, everybody loses, right? This is not about trying to say that rural America is everybody should flood to rural America. It's about saying that there are values and value in these rural communities that really need to be expressed in an authentic way. So it's a complex conversation to have, but really, essentially, we owe our food security to these communities, and we want to make sure that they are positioned and the stories being told around these communities are true and authentic.
Excellent. And I love that you're talking about bringing superpowers into this, right? The superpowers of rural America, the superpowers of Land O'Lakes. Tristen, I want to understand from a Getty Images perspective why this work feels important and why now from our perspective as well.
Yeah, our superpower is visual storytelling. So I think one of the things we've thought about for a really long time is authenticity in visuals, especially because we have this immense responsibility to sort of represent the world as it is, and also as we hope and imagine it to be in the future. Mm-hmm. And our imagery, we've invested a lot of time and effort and attention in looking at underrepresented communities, especially over the last 10 years. We've looked at LGBTQI plus folks, we've looked at women, we've looked at people with disabilities, really bringing more authenticity to what life looks like as we age, communities of color. When Land O'Lakes came to us, though, it was the first time we were really thinking about, frankly, rural communities. And that was as the moment that we, saw it as a blind spot. It was like, okay, we have to do this, especially because, there's so much, as Heather has spoken to, there's so much that these rural communities can contribute to our lives. So there's so much of a profound role that they play in the sort of functioning of this country. And so it felt like the right challenge at exactly the right time because we hadn't thought about that. And, that's the sort of signals that we look to for embarking on work like this. And it's really been an immense privilege to be a part of it.
Amazing. Heather, you all came to this with research of your own, which is another unusual circumstance here. It's rare that customers come to us and they're able to talk to us about their own research. I want to hear a little bit about the research that you all have done and some of the insights you uncovered, because all of that led to this aha moment that Tristen's talking about.
Yeah, and it was interesting because it was one of those things. I remember the moment we were sitting in a meeting. And as we think about our enterprise brand as Land O'Lakes, so we have 3 business divisions underneath the Land O'Lakes sort of broader enterprise brand. And as we were thinking about that, one of our pillars is a safe and plentiful food supply. One of our pillars is a sustainable futures, which is a broader term on sustainability around prosperity within the industry. And then the other one was vibrant rural communities. And, we're sitting in an office in Minnesota and we're all looking at each other going like, what does that actually mean? Because we could sit here in an urban environment and talk about it, but let's go out and talk to people. So we did some research, pretty extensive research on rural America. And we've done a couple of deep dives since then around different generations and things too. And we also talked to people in urban centers and sort of tried to get the perceptions here. And what was really interesting for us is people who work in agriculture actually only comprise 1% of the workforce, yet they deliver 87% of the food that we consume in the US. So just think about that for a second, right? 1% of the workforce in agriculture producing 87% of the food. And rural communities, about 63% of all US counties are rural communities. So It's imperative that we tell these stories in the right way. And I think one of the things that we started to think about was, okay, so if rural America is undervalued and misunderstood, how do we as a farmer-owned cooperative convene with other organizations to make this change?
And this convergence of data and creativity and storytelling, right? It's what we've done here under this partnership. It's what we do best.
Yes.
And here at Getty, we've got access to proprietary search data. We understand at a consumer level, right, what audiences are interested in. We're always doing new research. And as you started to dig in, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you saw that made you think the narrative really needs to change, and again, uncovered a new opportunity here.
Yeah, I want to first underscore how incredibly valuable the research that the Land O'Lakes team did and brought to the table was as being this kind of jumping off point for our research. There were a lot of things that we didn't know, and they have a lot of expertise in this sort of on this topic that we were able to really lean into, which, as you've pointed out, Tawnya, is a little bit unusual for how we do research. The things that jumped out to us before we even looked at our own data were, those findings that Heather somewhat surfaced. So, for example, rural not being the opposite of urban, that it has its own unique culture and value system and structures and and interdependencies and ways in which the communities exist and thrive that we need to be thinking about, that it's a lot more diverse than people realize, and that there are a lot of stereotypes that actually exist around the diversity of the rural United States, and yet we know from the research tells us, and actually how intersectional their research that they included were from some of their respondents, that there's a lot more diversity there, and that industry looks different, but it exists and it thrives. These are centers of innovation just in a lot of the different ways that we often don't expect and are definitely not telling stories around. And that finally, this idea of community, this idea of connection, those are kind of the centerpiece of the values that drive rural life. And so when we went into our research, it was through those kind of lenses of how do we figure out what is being depicted actually in visual, what choices that our marketing and advertisers actually making, and do those choices reflect those learnings. And for us, first and foremost, it's like, how visible are rural Americans, in visuals, and rural places writ large in visuals. 87%, there's estimates that 87% of U.S. land is actually rural. Now there's debates on whether, there's a lot of disparate data points on that, but even just taking that massive number, of course, we would expect to see at least some kind of parity between that number. 20% of the population lives in those rural places, and we would hope to see some of that parity. But what we ended up finding through our visual GPS research was that only 5% of the visuals that are chosen by marketers and advertisers or partners are actually set in rural locations in the U.S. In fact, urban settings are 4 times more likely to appear than rural ones. And that's a massive, massive gap from those numbers we talked about. And the fact that often, another thing that Heather sort of mentioned was the emphasis on these pastoral scenes in these landscapes, and not necessarily showing this sort of human dynamism that's powering this life there. A lot of these places are incredibly beautiful, but there's so much more to life. There's, humans that live there that power these places, and yet we don't often see that in visuals. And so even just that as a jumping off point, made us want to ask a lot more questions about what was missing. And it was really good. It was a juicy research problem to try and solve as a team.
I just to build on that too, I think one of the things just reminded me of in our research too was thinking around, like, we knew inherently from the work that we do with our farmer owners in those communities that it's like a hotbed of entrepreneurism and things, often by necessity. I think if you have ever spent any time with a farmer, you'll realize they're probably some of the most creative, entrepreneurial people you've ever met in your life. We call them the original entrepreneurs because they constantly have to keep reinventing what they're doing. But one of the things that we understood from our research too is in the past, like in the distant past, these communities were often formed by extractive industries coming in and then providing jobs in that industry. So think about mining and other things, or the railroad or whatever it might have been. And then when those industries left, it dissipated the communities. Today, what's happening is many of the people living in those communities, particularly the younger generation, but not necessarily just the younger generation, are starting up their own businesses that are bringing vibrancy to these rural downtowns because of their creativity and innovation and how they're thinking about things. And many of them want to stay in their hometowns, which is wonderful, right? So they're infusing that energy back into the community. So the communities become much more resilient because they're not based on an industry that could, in a couple of years just disappear. So yeah, lots of really good things. And again, to Tristan's point, none of that story was being told visually, or certainly not for the most part.
Tristen, when did it click for you that this was an opportunity to shift perception and that we had to take some action here?
I mean, truthfully, the moment we had our first conversation back in May of last year, but I think as we really started to do this work, there's this amazing quote from an activist and educator, Marian Wright Edelman, that comes to mind that we use quite a bit. You can't be what you can't see.
Yep.
So once we started to see how invisible these communities were being rendered, how much stereotyping and cliches that might have existed for these communities, it really said to us, oh, there's a lot we can do here together. The powerful part of this work isn't that it's just the playbook, and as Heather has said, it's the collection, and then it's this amplification. It's the ability to start this conversation and be this sort of rising tide that brings this to the forefront, that lifts the boat. We don't have any illusions about changing the world, but what we can do is to start, having and changing these conversations.
Yeah. And Stacey, I want to bring you closer here because you are a force and we're a big part of bringing many different threads together to actually execute on this and turn it into something so meaningful for us. So I want to start just by asking you about the scope and scale of the partnership. Can you just kind of level set us and help us understand the scale here?
Yeah, for sure. So as Tristen mentioned, this is a collaboration that started over a year ago with project teams from both sides collaborating. It was truly a meeting of the minds, as both of these guys have mentioned, and all the pieces of the puzzle have been touched on already. But what we aligned around in terms of scope was, three top line components. First, the research, the collaboration across our research, our visual GPS research, the Land O'Lakes research, and just that interrogation of the visuals on our site, and recommendations, right? Recommendations for gaps and places and areas to focus on. The second component was content creation, right? Calling on our community, our creators and visual experts to make new visuals informed by all of that research. And the third component, of course, was that call to action, the playbook, sharing the research, and an actionable way to utilize content for marketers to utilize this content in their work.
And Heather, while we're talking about taking action, I also want to create some space to talk a little bit more about the Modern Rural Collective and how you see the collective continuing to play a really important role as we tell more authentic stories and taking this work forward.
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about it, but we are one voice. I think we're a pretty strong voice in this space, so I don't want to underestimate that. But we need to work with others, and we're a convener brand. We've done this on a number of projects, including the American Connection project, which was launched in 2019. Really, the stimulus was from our CEO, who was incredibly. If you think I'm passionate about this, you should listen to Beth talk about rural America and our member owners. But the fact of the matter was that a considerable amount of people, I think about 42 million Americans, did not have access to the internet. And if you think about to think about COVID times where we had our kids going to doing their homework online. That wasn't an option for a lot of people in rural communities. So she formed the American Connection Project, which was a coalition and a collective of companies, about 170 companies, to come together to put pressure on the government for funding to do just that. So the Modern Rural Collective was in many ways inspired by that, because I sat there and said, well, this is amazing work. What could we do as a marketing industry in our space? And for me, that's storytelling. So how do we tell more authentic stories? So we formed this Modern Rural Collective. We had, I'll be honest, I was at South by Southwest 2 years ago, and I talked about it from stage. And I had said to my team, like, I love bringing awareness of this issue to light, but I need a call to action. Like, I need to be able to, because people keep saying to me, how can I help? So we formed this collective. I had people raise their hands, and we had an overwhelming response from brands. And I think, so we have a lot of people who are very interested in joining us. What we have tried to do, though, I think over the last year, is who are those core partners that we can work together to really shift the cultural conversation. So as I said, we're looking at it from a visual standpoint, we're looking at it from a written standpoint, and working with some partners right now on how do we impact film, TV, entertainment. Because you think about like the Netflix effect, like that, that's a real thing, right? You put a documentary on Netflix, everybody's talking about it. So how do we impact the written narrative in those spaces? And then how do we think about it from a music standpoint as well? So these areas that really start to shape culture. So Repicturing Rural, what's been most exciting, I would say, is, it's a tangible example of the kinds of things we're wanting to do. And it has been incredibly well received. I was out last week talking about it.
I want to check in with both of you, Heather and Tristen, on just understanding a little bit more about the research and what surprised you the most as you dug in.
Tristen, you want to?
What surprised you, Heather? I'm so curious.
The thing and the example that I give people that just really struck home for me, because I'm always looking at where the contrasts are, and like how do these stories start to get out of control in terms of these stereotypes and things. The thing that most surprised me, I think, in the research is when I thought about, and we did a bit of a dive on Gen Z in our research too, but in the visual GPS research, Gen Z in urban settings shows up with their friends, they're using technology, they're doing fun things that friends do. That is absolutely not the case in rural images. In rural images today, and this is what we're trying to shift, right? They tend to not be with friends, they're not using technology. They tend to be maybe working on a farm. But really, and with family. So it's just we're continuing with these images, we're continuing to showcase like the vast divide between urban and rural, which is really not there. Gen Z in rural America is as creative, entrepreneurial, and fun as people who live in urban cities. They're doing different things, but so we're also, I think that was the starkness of those images. I think the difference between those images was the thing that really kind of struck me.
That was definitely surprising. It was actually really shocking as we started to uncover that. I think another thing that was shocking to us was the lack of interiority of the lives of the people that were depicted in these visuals. So, I mentioned before, it's not a lot of people present, period. But when they were present, they were often outdoors. It was either heavily agricultural or doing some sort of nature walk activity, etc. And you don't get to see the interiors of their lives. You don't get to see families at home, making a meal together, which was actually one of the things we focused on when we were creating content together. You don't get to see people with friends and community around them, kind of just enjoying day-to-day activities, leisure activities, young people especially, but also other folks of all ages. You really didn't get to see these sort of everyday minutia of the lives that people in rural America live. And that, to me, is powerful because, visuals can play a really major role in humanizing communities. It can uphold stereotypes, but it can also break them down and make folks seem a lot more human. And you can see yourself in those visuals, even if you don't live in those places. And so I think that was like the fact that was the habit, which kind of is the inversion of what we see in urban settings, was so shocking to me. I did not go in thinking that, we have our ideas when we go into the research process. I did not think that was something I was going to uncover.
I think it's interesting to me too, because I thought about this for a while and I was like, is it because people want to be sort of obvious that this is a rural community, hence it's outside, so there's less buildings. So I think some of that, but I think, so there's a piece for me, I think to Tristan's point, there's a piece for me, which is the stark differences. There's also a piece for me that what was lacking was some of the amazing nuances of rural communities around like high school sports. And like, there's a Friday Night Lights is a thing. It's not just a show, which I learned, but there's like a lot of things happening in those communities that may not happen in urban communities that are not celebrated either. So yeah, it's just, this is why I'm so excited about this work, because I think the power of the visual is, as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. I think this is going to be a really impactful piece of work for people to take and use and actually do something with. It'll start over time to change the conversation.
It's actually a great point, though, Heather. I just want to add to that is like aspiration is usually the marketer's kind of, North Star is to create this sort of aspirational lifestyle, the aspirational consumer, try and reach as many people as possible. And so often there's this defaulting to these very upper crusty middle class homes, these coastal places because we want things to look sleek and slick and beautiful. But that's actually not what people really want. And also there are widening definitions of what's beautiful and aspirational to people. And that, these homes that are more lived in, that are smaller footprint, that, don't have these bright white kitchens, that have character and personality, is actually what people want more than these kind of really sleek and slick type of imagery that has, to me, it feels like the sort of marketing and advertising of yesteryear.
And a perfect way for me to really dig in, Tristen, and understand the visual direction here, because you're painting a picture right now, right, as you're talking us through the opportunity. But we built this research and the playbook and the collection around pillars of people, places, and activities. So talk to us a little bit about how you steered that visual direction and where we brought in visual GPS to help.
Yeah, we wanted to look at the rural experiences that we knew were most likely to be visually stereotyped, based on, things that we were seeing in Land O'Lakes' research, but also things that we were seeing preliminarily on our side as we started to do some discovery. We wanted to look at, for example, with people, who is actually represented, is that avatar of the typical rural person, and where are they seen? When are they seen? What do those visuals look like? How is this disconnected to or connected to the realities of rural US? And using those pillars to kind of really help us dig deeper so that we could give really specific guidance to Stacy and her team about what we actually needed to create. We wanted to really give something that was meaningful for us to build a sort of plan and a strategy around addressing those gaps around. So for example, when we were looking at people, we were looking at that interiority. How do we bring forward more that interiority, those passions, those hobbies, those interests, the everyday slice of life? For places, what were the places that were often not represented? Like we have these big pastoral landscapes, but like we're leaving out things like Appalachia. We're leaving out places like New England. We're leaving out, places even in the Pacific Northwest, which is incredibly rural, but yet we only focus on the Portlands and the Seattles. And sometimes we get a little bit of a mountain hiking kind of vibe, but we don't get those small coastal towns, for example. And then activities, to Heather's point earlier, we talked about like, what does work look like? What does industry look like? What does the thriving office workplace look like? There are office work that happens in rural places. There's retail establishments, there's service work, there's a lot of entrepreneurship. In fact, more entrepreneurship in rural places than there are in urban places, which is a myth bust, myth that the Land O'Lakes team was really useful in busting for us. And what does school look like? What does healthcare look like? That's really important for us to visualize. And so we wanted to be able to give really specific guidance on these different dimensions so that we could really make the change we wanted to see.
And this was an active partnership in that we were going now and creating content, developing content in real time to support some of these insights and the action that we all needed to take. Stacy, I'd love to hear about that process and how you and the team approach bringing real people, real places, authentic moments to life, and what you wanted to do differently to ensure that we're able to portray things accurately, authentically.
Yeah, so the way, the way we make content, right? Custom content, it uses the engine that powers Getty Images, right? So we're relying on the same creators, the same personal networks, modes of production that create content for gettyimages.com. And I think that the difference, right, in with any partnership, is that we allow customers to drive the briefs and the asks for content. So for this partnership in particular, what was unique about it is it was our insights team that suggested a set of 15 briefs for Land O'Lakes to choose from, right? And those were all based in the research and the gaps we saw. So it was a super, super collaborative process. Once we had aligned on the briefs, we leveraged the community of creators to do what they do, right? Bring their perspectives to Land O'Lakes, interpreting each one of the briefs uniquely with a sense of place and a sense of community, since, these creators in nearly all cases are living in and connected to the communities that they're photographing.
And you're getting into the process a little bit, but I want to talk a little bit more about that creative briefing process, Stacey, and help us understand how we took that to translate a brief into final imagery and themes that we can see in the collection today.
Yeah, so, Land O'Lakes, they do their own content creation just like most of our customers do, right? But in this case, we were able to supplement, their own visual content in parts of the country, for example, where they have less of a presence themselves, the ones that Tristen just mentioned, the South, New England, the Pacific Northwest. And I think the other way we were able to really lean into something different was interest areas, right? Like office work, authentic content around veterans that were, less directly connected to the Land O'Lakes business. They were really smart, and they leveraged our capabilities to extend their reach, right? And augment what they were themselves doing through their own teams.
And Heather, we came to you with brief ideas, probably a long list of brief ideas, right? That you and the team helped us curate based on your insights. Again, total collaboration, start to finish. I'd love to hear from you on, why it was important to bring these stories to life with a fresh image collection. You could have curated what you already had, right? We could have done things differently, but you wanted to build a new collection and then make that collection available to people everywhere. Why was that important for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I still get this, although it's a little less now, so I must be doing my job somewhat. When I'll turn up in rooms to talk about this, and people are like, why are Land O'Lakes talking about this? And they're like, oh, farmer-owned cooperative, get it. In this case, yeah, I mean, we actually I've been at Land O'Lakes for 5 years now, and over the last 5 years, we've actually collected some beautiful imagery of rural America, which we could have curated and had people use. However, the impact of that would have been much smaller than working with, again, Getty, who has so much credibility in this space. So I think the combination of our brands, it helps us make that impact at scale faster, which is what we really wanted to do. So, and again, this isn't a Land O'Lakes thing. This is really on a mission to support rural America. And so it felt like the absolute right partner for us. And I think the other thing for me, as I said, is like less theory and more like action. So here's like literally, what can you do? Here's a playbook. Take the playbook, download the imagery, use the imagery, and help us change this story. And I've been in front of, really large CPG companies and other companies that are like, you're right. We haven't been telling these stories authentically. So it's like there's almost no excuse now. We have a whole library of things available for people to use. So
no excuses. Tristen, maybe tell us a little bit more about the scale of the collection, because again, another unusual thing about this, sometimes we create content for customers. It's exclusive. They use it. It stays in their library. But Land O'Lakes have done something really incredible here, right? It's available to everybody because we want that action. So Tristen, what does this mean for customers as well as the creative community more broadly?
Yeah, I am so proud of this collection. It was pulled together by our amazing curation and promotion team as part of the kind of back half of this project. where we started was we had these aspirations. All right, we're going to take the imagery that we make with Land O'Lakes. We're going to supplement it with some things that we think are really reflective and authentic to rural experiences that exist in our own pre-shot collection. We had this vision in mind for that. We're like, if we get 1,000, that's fine. That feels like a win to start with. And where we ended up was we actually are at about 1,700 assets as of today. We were almost 73% of our original target. It's right now stills only, but what was really great about it is that it's almost 50-50 our existing content and the content that we created through custom, which was so exciting, which means, we were really grateful that the Land O'Lakes team did the unusual thing and made this available and said, we're going to invest this and we're going to make it available to you all to start that conversation. And we have over almost 250 creators represented that work with us in this collection and visuals from each of the 50 states. So we tried really hard to get that regional diversity in there, and we're not done. This isn't just, okay, check, we've launched this and now we're done with this conversation. No, for us, it's like, now that we've seen this commitment, we're going to continue to invest our resources. We're going to be spending a lot of 2026 bringing in more content into this, really agitating for our customers to think a little bit more thoroughly about this, but also bringing video into this, stories, and kind of whatever other gaps we weren't able to cover in this first wave, we're going to continue to, because we see this as not just one and done. This is lifelong work. This is career spanning work for us to make the change that we want to see.
Well, and something so clever about the playbook is that it includes these rural reality checks. Stacey, I think you brought an insight. You were having a conversation and referred to these as speed bumps, right? These little moments where you need to kind of check yourself. I want to hear more about that. And Tristen, as a follow-up, I also want to hear from you about, why it was so important to create those moments of pause in the playbooks and what you want people to get out of it.
Yeah, I'll give it a start, but the speed bumps, I definitely that's from Tristen. So, but I appreciate the sentiment, right? It's about, as you're choosing imagery, taking a moment to pause, right? Taking a moment to think about your choices, think about those, well-worn trails that, your mind typically goes down, and to actually interrogate that reality for a second. And so, those are sprinkled all throughout the playbook. And I think give a really good, actionable, thing that people can latch on to start that process and to continue that process over time.
Yeah, 100%. It's all about, as Heather said, what's tangible, what's actionable, what's the moment that you can take right now to think about the change that we want to make here. And we do this actually with all of our sort of authenticity and inclusion storytelling, across a variety of different communities. And what was unique here for these particular questions were they were directly connected to the dimensions where we see the most possible change that could be that could leave the greatest possible impact if you make a different choice in that moment. So asking yourself those questions are really powerful, and they are really simple. And it doesn't matter if you're an art director kind of concepting in a whole shoot, or you're sitting and a designer is sitting and choosing a visual, or you're a brand marketing manager, or even to Heather's point earlier in media, like what image is following this piece that you're writing about rural places. It's that moment where you can ask yourself that question when you're about to make something that is visual and put it out into the world.
And as I mentioned, it's all about action. We want to see action. We want to see impact. So Heather, as we wrap up, I want to give the floor to you. What's your call to action? What do you want people to go out and do now?
I think, and I said this last week when I was at GoodCon too, I was like, have a conversation, be curious about rural America. So we're telling you, obviously, rural and urban are both vibrant. So again, it's not rural good, urban bad. They're both vibrant, they're both evolving, and they're both moving our country forward. And again, we tend to pit them against each other, and even in the visual space, we're doing that. When we do that, everybody loses. So we'd love people to get engaged with the Modern Rural Collective. It's, really, whether it's downloading the playbook and using that, or engaging in that, start telling authentic stories, this collective action by the whole marketing community will really have a big impact. We have, one of the biggest impacts in changing people's perceptions. So let's come together and do that instead of our CEO always, I love this phrase. She says, stop admiring the problem and go do something about it. That's what I would say to the marketing industry and the media, to be honest with you. Let's stop admiring the problem and just get out there and take some action. So we now have a tangible asset, a beautiful tangible asset for people to use. So I'd ask people to get out and use those. And I know we've obviously got the images on Getty Images. We've also got a selection of images that will be made available on Unsplash. So which also super excited. I had a couple of people ask me about that last week. So get out there and tell authentic stories and use the tools that we're giving you to do that.
Thank you all. This conversation has been a blast. You're all passionate. We're creating meaning here. We're really excited about this. So thank you for the time today.
Thank you.
I'll send it back to Jen, and then we'll get into some Q&A. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, team. Live Q&A is just moments away. But first, let me tell you about a product that our panel just spoke about, custom content. Picture this, your vision perfectly captured with stunning images or videos made just for you. At Getty Images, we've got over 550,000 creators worldwide, bringing fresh, authentic, and diverse perspectives to life, tapping into the latest visual GPS data-backed insights in our decades of expertise to help guide them. That's why the biggest brands in the world trust us to enhance their visual stories. From social to digital and beyond, we deliver content that's on brand, on budget, and 100% yours to own. So, you don't just have to picture it, let's make it happen. Reach out to your Getty Images representative to execute your vision with custom content, or scan the QR code and complete the Contact Me form. Welcome back, downloaders, to today's live Q&A session. Joining us live are Heather, Tawnya, Tristen, and Stacy to answer any questions about the Repicturing Rural Playbook, the new Rural U.S. collections, or anything else about that project. There are about 250 of you joining us live today, and the floor is now open. So drop your questions in the Q&A below, and we'll get to as many as we can. Hi, everyone. So great to see you. Okay, let's see what questions we have coming in. Stacy, I have one for you. Which other sectors or industries do you think could benefit from using the playbook and the collection?
Thanks, Jennifer, and hi everyone. Thanks for listening and watching today. We spoke to this a little bit on the webinar. I think, the rural audience is one that needs to be spoken to essentially by every business, every sector. So in short, everybody benefits: healthcare businesses, financial businesses, consumer goods, media in general, really. Any and every brand benefits from being able to speak authentically to an audience and to meet them where they are with realism and a true sense of being seen,
And I couldn't agree more. I think on a personal level, this project is so important. You might not know from my sophisticated accent, but I grew up in rural Alabama. Can I say rural? That's a different thing. But we have healthcare, we have all the things. So I think that anyone could benefit from this. Let's see. I have one here for you, Heather. Welcome. Nice to see you.
Hi there.
What what lasting impact do you hope that Repicturing Rural will have on how rural America is perceived and represented by brands and media?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So I think our hope is that over time we're going to shift these stories. But I want people to understand that actually we're not as different as people might perceive us to be. So I think the lasting impact for me is making sure that we start to see these authentic stories showing up in a variety of different channels, that we see the media telling authentic stories, and actually this was something when we had our discussion I thought was brilliant. And I think Tristen, you were the one who talked about this, was when we talk about innovation and stories about innovation, we should show rural America. It shouldn't always be Silicon Valley or some of those other things. I think really starting to shift the way that people are storytelling and using rural as a really great example for some of those things like innovation, entrepreneurship, creativity, vibrancy, all of those things. So that would be the hope.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather. And just a reminder, everyone, use the Q&A function here to drop your live questions. Let's see. I have one here for Tristen. Hi, Tristen. Are there plans to add more rural New England imagery like Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, etc.?
Yeah, one of the things that's really exciting about this work is actually that we're going to continue to grow this collection. This is not just a sort of one moment in time and then we're done. We think of this as an ongoing commitment to depict rural communities. And I think for New England in particular, that was actually underrepresented in terms of our visuals. We didn't see a lot of, I was actually just out in Connecticut. We didn't see a lot of rural places in Connecticut or in Maine or in New Hampshire. We know that there's, Vermont, for example, is predominantly rural, for example. So I think that there's a lot of stories left to tell, and we're excited to be able to continue on with that work.
Perfect. And you're not off the hook yet. I have another one that you might be able to answer. Heather, you might be able to answer it as well. Question is, well, first of all, thank you so much for sharing the thinking behind this work, period. What words of advice would you give to researchers trying to make a business case similar research that explores the unexplored, like you had mentioned? I guess the question, what words of advice would you give to researchers trying to make a business case for exploring the unexplored in different types of projects?
Is that for me or for Heather? Sorry, I missed.
Either one of you. I think you're both experts. I can throw it to you, Tristen.
Yeah, sure. I would say that there's so many stories to tell. This is a large part of the US population, first and foremost. More 20% of people live in rural places, and over 87% of our land, by some estimates, are defined as rural places. So there's a lot left to do here. Only 5%, as I mentioned during the pre-recorded session, that only 5% of visuals actually reflect rural places. So to me, it's about just starting with those facts and then getting curious about how you can particularly and specifically bring this work to your world.
Perfect.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead, Heather. Please
Yeah,
add
I was
on.
just gonna say, I totally agree with that. And I think, what's interesting, we're, as I said, at the heart of everything that we do are rural communities. So we're sort of steeped in that. So we saw a lot of those stereotypes and, and I hear it a lot when I'm out and about and speaking and things with people. So we knew the issue was there, and again, dived into this from a research standpoint. So I think it's initially, whether it's about rural America or something else, because I'm thinking the question might be a little broader too, is just highlighting some of the things that you see that are interesting and compelling enough that you want to find out more about to whoever you're talking to. I mean, like bringing some of those things to life. I think this has been really interesting as I've seen, as we've been out on social media talking about this. I've had a number of companies who've said to me, we have the same issue. So, and this was, there was a lady from Open Table that sent me a note and said, we've been thinking about how do we show like a business dinner, and all we get are 6 white men sitting around a table in suits. And she said, that's not the vision of a business dinner today, but that's what comes up. And she said, this is actually making me think that we need to do something like this in our industry too. And I thought that's fantastic. So I hope that this work, another part of the lasting impact, is that it gets people just to be curious about some of these things where there are a lot of stereotypes associated. So we can dig in. But the research, I think, is really important because, again, going all the way back to our comment around, what is a vibrant community? What does that really mean? That work was really important to be able to come to the table with our partners at Getty to do this and get a much richer outcome, I would say.
Perfect. Thank you, Heather. And I have another one for you here. I think it's a tough one, but it's a very important question. What is the definition of rural America to you?
To me, it might be one thing, but I'll tell you, it's an interesting question because it's quite complex in the way you would answer it because it keeps shifting, which is not always a good thing. So I think it's a population of 5,000. Urban is a population of 5,000 or more. But again, rural isn't urban, right? So it varies, is what I would say. And it's a really hard question to answer, and that's not a good way to answer it, but it does really vary. Because you think about a population of 5,000, that kind of feels small, right? One of the things I will tell you, though, one of the things that was interesting in the research that we did as we thought about sort of vibrancy in rural America is we talked to people in rural America about their concept of growth and what does growth mean for them about their community. And the last thing they want is population growth, because if they get to a certain size, they're not considered rural anymore, and they're very proud of their ruralness. It also means that resources change and some other things change accordingly. So yeah, hard question to answer, but it's depending on who you ask, you'll get a very different answer. But
Yeah, it was a tricky one for us too. And I think it was actually something I really latched onto from the research your team provided, Heather, because it sort of exists on this continuum and a spectrum. There are places that can be defined as rural, and it can be up to 50,000 residents, depending on the way the land is defined around it. And so I think that was something that we were really conscious of, that there are a lot of sort of nuances and layers to the definition of rural. In fact, there's a comment in one of the Q&A section about, stereotypes and, the images of the young Black kids doing sports. It could be read as suburban. And in fact, this came from a rural place. And what we're trying to do is trouble these notions about who is depicted and how. And because these are truly authentically rural places, it just exists in that continuum and that spectrum definition that I think a lot of us are not maybe conscious of or aware of, because we don't talk about these rural places in the ways that we should.
Thanks, Tristen. Heather, I have one here for you, and this might be helpful for a lot of our audience members. The question says, my company, MSpark, has been connecting with rural communities since 1988 through direct mail, shared mail, and digital advertising. We have deep household audience data across C and D counties. What's the best way for us to share these insights with the collective team?
Oh, fantastic.
We love it, right?
So I can put our email in the chat if is that helpful? And then we can get connected and we can talk through some of that. We'd love to see what data they have and how we can help them and they can help us. So I'll put that in the chat right now, and then please do reach out. We've had, as I said, a really great reaction to this work, and we want to bring more people on. This is not a Getty Land O'Lakes thing. It's not a Land O'Lakes thing. We want to pull like-minded people who have a shared vision here. So a little bit of the more the merrier, to be honest with you, and love a bit of data. So send it on.
We love data. Tristen, I have one here for you. How can one access the image collections? For instance, my agency does a lot of work with rural clients, and this type of imagery will be very useful. So where can they access it?
By searching rural US collection on gettyimages.com.
Perfect. Easy enough. And then
there's also a link to it in the playbook as well. So for everybody who's downloading the playbook, there are links to the collection in there too.
Okay, thanks, Stacy. Let's see. I have another one. It says not so much a question as more of a comment or an observation. Unless the imagery is supporting a specifically rural story, images of teenagers practicing cheers or sports or Black families barbecuing on a deck could as easily be read as suburbia. But used in a specifically rural story, such photos bring surprise and diversity. Tristen, you kind of touched on that a little bit. Does anyone have anything to add to that comment at all? We kind of already covered it.
We did. I mean, I would just say that there's so many misconceptions about who lives in rural places. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily totally coming from that place of stereotype, but we know that that exists out there. Yeah. And, there are about 28% of Black Americans live in the rural South, and yet we don't necessarily see that depicted. And so I think one of the things, and that contributes to this notion that, for example, Black Americans predominantly predominantly live in urban places, which is not necessarily the case. And so I want to just us to challenge ourselves, the industry to challenge ourselves to think a little bit differently. And hopefully this data is a good jumping off point for us to do that work.
Perfect. Thanks for expanding on that. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Jennifer, so I think I mentioned it in the original conversation we had, but I do think sometimes in the process of trying to show a contrast and something specifically that looks like a, rural, we're not good at doing that. I think what we end up doing is doing stereotypes, right? So it's like, oh, there's a field and a farm and somebody with, with their combine harvesters. It's got to be rural, right? When actually, like I said, I would love to see us show rural America for things like innovation and creativity and entrepreneurship and all of those other amazing things that happen, and those community aspects that are alive and well in those communities that just don't get shown because people think, well, that's, that could be either. So it's not distinctly rural, but when we do that, we perpetuate the stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And can I just correct myself really quickly? I had a number inverted. So actually 80% of Black Americans live in rural places in the South, and only 28% are shown actually in those places. And so I think that that's a huge disparity, and there's a lot of misconceptions. I knew I was like, something is wrong here, but I hope that I can confirm that and affirm that for you guys, because it really does underscore the need to tell these stories.
We're live, y'all. This is just proof. We go back and
there you
make our
go.
corrections right on the spot. I have a question here. I'm going to throw this out to the group as a whole, and feel free to add your commentary. As an individual who grew up in and loves rural America, this type of work is so refreshing. Today, I'm a marketer living in a metropolitan area, and I find it hard to get my urban colleagues to understand the power of this type of storytelling. Given that rural America makes up less than 20% of the US population, I wonder how you think about making these stories understandable and relatable to the majority of consumers. Kind of touches on those stereotypes you ladies were talking about. Does anyone have anything further to add on this question?
I'd love to jump in and just start, and I want to hear from the group. But I would just say to the person answering, don't underestimate how many people there are like you, right? There are folks that grow up in rural America and move to an urban area, and they're part of a different population, but they've got these roots, they've got this history. And I actually find that to be a really common story, somewhat anecdotally, but also as we get into this research, people have roots in rural America. And so don't underestimate the size of the audience.
Anyone else want to add anything?
I think the other thing I would say, just, some of the things that we focused on, I've been talking about recently, is the value and the values of rural America are not that different from people in urban cities. What I love is usually, and I've had people literally jump out of their chairs when I start talking about this. They're like, I'm from a small town. This is great. Like people are like, finally, we're legitimizing these small towns and where I came from. So I'm hoping it's going to help some of those people have that conversation with people who may not have been brought up in a rural environment. But I think, talking about the values that exist in rural America, which in some cases I think we've lost in other parts of the country, around the community impact and the feel of neighbors helping neighbors and doing things for each other and coming together to solve problems. All of those things are really rich and vibrant and kind of a necessity in those rural communities. We'd love that to kind of get infected into some of the more urban centers as well. So start the conversation. I think I'm hoping that this might actually be a tool to do that, to actually have that conversation. And if somebody says, where are you from? And you say a small town and they go, you're like, let me tell you about my small town.
Yeah,
People talk about it.
and I hope that we can start as an industry inverting these assumptions that we have, because I know not everyone lives in a big city either. People live in suburban and exurban places as well, and yet the default are often the coasts of New York City, Los Angeles, and maybe sometimes Miami if we're getting a little crazy, or Chicago. But that is not at all representative of the United States. So I think that we should sort of trouble these notions around who it's appealing to, and yet that has stood in for all of advertising for a really long time.
Yeah.
All right, everyone, I think we're low on time here, so I'm going to ask one last question to the group. Since Tristen, actually, in the group can jump in. Since the launch, what reactions have you seen from media, rural communities, and marketers?
Oh, overwhelmingly positive. I mean, you can see it here even in the chat for us. I know Heather and myself have gotten so many comments on LinkedIn, so many organic posts of people amplifying this work. We didn't tell them to, and they're sharing their own stories about coming from, like the anecdote that Tawnya said about coming from rural places and living in big cities and hearing someone talk about that experience for the first time. It's just been incredibly powerful and really inspiring for us to continue this work.
Thanks so much. And everyone, that's our show for today. Thank you for submitting your questions. Answers to anything we didn't get to today will be followed up on later this week. Thanks to Heather, Tawnya, Tristen, and Stacy for sharing your insights and your expertise. As a reminder, you can download the Repicturing Rural Playbook at visualgps.com. We'll drop the direct link for you in the chat. If you have questions about the rural U.S. collections, custom content, visual GPS, or any of our products or services, please contact your Getty Images representatives or email us at thedownload@gettyimages.com. As you exit today, there will be a quick poll for some instant feedback for today's episode. Please take a moment to let us know how we can serve you better. Thank you once again for joining us today. I've been your host, Jennifer Kelly, and we'll see you next time on The Download.